3 times, the world almost ended. Welcome to Your Dose of Wowness.
A policeman is dying from a scratch, a rose thorn, nothing more. Then a new drug starts working, and for a few days he's winning, and then the supply runs out. This drug would go on to save more lives than almost any other medical discovery in human history, but it almost didn't survive its very first patient. This is the story of how penicillin almost wasn't ready in time. The drug that would eventually turn the tide for that patient was discovered entirely by accident in 1928, when bacteriologist Alexander Fleming noticed a strange mold growing on an uncovered petri dish. Fleming correctly deduced that this mold was actively killing the bacteria around it. But noticing the effect and bottling it are two different things. He lacked the specialized biochemistry expertise required to extract and stabilize the active compound into anything resembling a usable medicine. So, after publishing a paper on his findings in 1929, he largely moved on. For the timeline of modern medicine, this is where the story nearly stops. The mold was essentially abandoned. Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928. Nobody used it as medicine until 1940. That's a 12-year gap most people have never heard about. Identifying a scientific curiosity in a lab is an entirely separate achievement from engineering a therapeutic drug. Without further action, this discovery was just a biological footnote, scientifically interesting but practically useless. The long dormancy finally ended in the late 1930s at Oxford University. Pathologist Howard Florey was searching for natural antibacterial substances, and he pulled Fleming's forgotten paper back into the light. Florey partnered with Ernst Chain, a biochemist with the precise technical skills Fleming had lacked. Chain figured out how to extract and stabilize a purified, concentrated form of the penicillin compound, but they were doing this in Britain at the onset of World War II. The nation was under aerial bombardment, and nearly all scientific funding and manufacturing capacity had been redirected to the war effort. The Oxford research team was forced to operate on a shoestring budget. The team trying to save the war effort was literally growing medicine in used bedpans and biscuit tins. Modern antibiotics began as a messy engineering problem, solved with repurposed kitchenware while the Blitz raged overhead. By February 1941, the team had finally cultured enough purified penicillin for a single human trial. The patient was Albert Alexander, the policeman from our introduction. A minor scratch from a rose thorn had spiraled into a massive, life-threatening infection that had resisted all available treatments. Within days of receiving the first penicillin injections, the results were staggering. Alexander's fever broke, and the overwhelming infection visibly retreated. But the makeshift bedpan extraction process was incredibly inefficient. It took an enormous volume of mold culture to yield just tiny amounts of purified drug, rapidly draining the entire supply before the infection was fully cleared. They were so desperate for more of the drug, they tried recovering it from his urine. It still wasn't enough. Alexander relapsed, and in March 1941, he died. Albert Alexander's death was a brutal clarification. The biological mechanism worked perfectly. The true obstacle standing between humanity and a medical miracle was the fatal bottleneck of mass-scale supply. To solve that bottleneck, the Oxford team had to face reality. Britain's blitz-battered manufacturing sector was physically incapable of producing pharmaceutical penicillin at the scale required. In the summer of 1941, Florey and his colleague Norman Heatley boarded a transatlantic flight to the United States. Their mission was to find an industrial partner with the pristine manufacturing capacity required to churn out the drug. 3 episodes into this arc, and I keep finding out how thin the margin actually was. If you're enjoying these near misses, subscribe so you catch the rest, and tell me in the comments which one so far has messed with your head the most. Their search led them to an agricultural research lab in Peoria, Illinois. It was here that the operation tapped into massive, untouched American industrial infrastructure, a stark contrast to the makeshift tins back in Oxford. Overcoming the penicillin crisis ultimately meant abandoning the country where it was discovered, handing the logistics over to a foreign superpower with the factories to back it up. This chart shows the breakthrough the researchers in Peoria developed: deep tank fermentation. By pumping air through massive vats of corn steep liquor, they completely replaced the shallow, low-yield surface culture methods used in Britain, creating an exponential output of the drug. But to maximize these giant vats, they needed a new biological catalyst. Fleming's original mold strain simply wasn't robust enough to survive and produce at that scale. The breakthrough that finally made mass production possible came from a moldy cantaloupe at a grocery store in Illinois. A lab assistant brought it in, and it turned out to carry a highly productive strain of Penicillin that became the ancestor for modern industrial production. With the right process and the right mold, major American pharmaceutical companies rapidly scaled up production, driven entirely by the pressing demands of the War Department. The industrial effort that ultimately secured the supply chain was an absurd hybrid of meticulous chemical engineering and complete grocery store luck. By the time of the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, penicillin production had reached extraordinary levels. The drug was deployed across the front lines, reaching combat hospitals just in time. Battlefield mortality rates from wound infections plummeted. For the first time in military history, an infection from shrapnel or a battlefield injury was no longer a guaranteed death sentence. Getting to that beach required an insanely fragile chain of events. It took a 1928 open window, a neglected paper, a team scraping by with bedpans, a fatal first trial, and a perfectly timed cantaloupe. Missing any one of these improbable links would have delayed the arrival of antibiotics by years. At wartime infection rates, that delay would have been measured in the graves of soldiers, who instead survived their wounds, and the millions who, for the first time, walked away from infections that used to be fatal. A moldy cantaloupe and a team of exhausted scientists saved millions of lives, just barely in time. Next time, the near miss isn't a scientific race. It's a single decision made by one man in 1945, based on nothing more than a memory of a vacation he once took. That decision saved an entire city. That's day 114, the Kyoto decision.